Today, we're actually going to be trying to answer a question that humans have been asking themselves for decades and even centuries. What is better, a cat or a dog? I know myself personally, I love cats. I mean, just look at them. How can you not love that? But now I'm going to ask you something. How do you know that this is a cat? I know some of you might say, well, I've seen hundreds and thousands of cats in my life. I know that this is a cat from memory. I've learned it. But actually, there's a lot more going on when you see a cat that you know that it's a cat. Now, what happens is the photons that get reflected off of the cat, they land in your eye. And in there, you have the red, the green, and the blue receptors. And they pick up that information from the photons. And that information gets passed on to the brain. And in the visual cortex, there's a lot of things happening. The first thing that happens is in V1 and V2 of the visual cortex, the foreground and the background is kind of distinguished. You know, you see the shape of the cat, you see that there's a certain structure, and then it gets passed on, and then what it sees, that object, it gets broken down into its features. You have the ears, the eyes, the nose, the whiskers, for example, and then in the next part, the catness comes into play. So you know the certain attributes that a cat has, the fur, the legs, and then your brain puts all of this information together, and based off of memory and things that it knows and has seen, it knows this is a cat. And now you might ask me again, well, why are we talking about the human brain? This is a day about artificial intelligence. Well, actually, machines see very similarly to how humans see. There's a lot of parallels to it. And when the thing is, for us, you know, we see the cat. A machine cannot just see an image and process it the way that we do, but it can break it down into its pixels. And pixels consist of 3 different kinds. You have red, green, and blue values for every single pixel, a value between 0 and 255. And those numbers is something that a computer can work with. And so this is where the neurons of our artificial brain, of our a neural network comes into place. So this is what a neuron of a neural network, a convolutional neural network, can look like. It has these weights, and these weights, they have learned based off of training to see something within an image. So what happens in convolution, that little weight, that little neuron that I had just shown you, that slides over the image one by one, the red one, the green one, and the blue one, and it takes all that information in. There's a lot of matrix multiplication going on, and based off of that, it sees something. In the training, when it was trained on, let's say there's a model distinguishing between cats and dog faces, it learned to look out for something specific. But we can do this more than once. So this is just one specific neuron that was trained on something. We can do it, for example, 16 times, and then we get 16 different pictures looking out for 16 different things. But we don't have to stop there. We can take those images now, take another set of neurons, and do the exact same process and get a new set of images. And then we can do the same thing again and again. And essentially what happens is, in the same way that it works with our brain, information gets passed along. So if you see in the first layer, those first neurons, they see very broad things. They kind of try to distinguish, well, there is a face, there's something going on, there's an object. And as it gets passed through its network, it starts to see way finer things. Like, for example, here you can see it probably picks up eyes or other minor things. But for us, it's very difficult to see what the network actually sees, but that's kind of what happens. The details become more and more finer. Now, just to quickly go over what happens then, every single picture in this last layer, every pixel gets essentially put into this giant string. It gets flattened out, and then we have one more layer of neurons. Those are then just individual neurons with a whole lot of weights. They're completely fully connected, so there's a lot of math again happening here, and that happens over and over for all of those neurons in the final layer. And then we get 256 numbers, essentially. And based off of those numbers, the model was able to learn, well, if I see these kind of numbers in that order, it's probably a cat or a dog. And this is how the model is then able to distinguish between cat and dog. So the decision happens in this part of the network, but surely the information must be somewhere way earlier. And our question is now, can we visualize what a CNN sees? Kind of like with a brain, we're able to see certain activations. Are we able to do this with a CNN? And the answer is yes, we can. What I want you to do, first of all, just look at the left part of this slide. So what we took is we took a cat face and a dog face, and we decided to morph it. I'm going to see if this works now with the clicker, just so you get familiar with the transformation. So this is the cat morphing into a dog. If I do it backwards, the dog morphing into a cat. And down here, you see the prediction of the model, predicting between cats and dog faces. So right now, it sees the cat, and it's predicting 0 for cat. 1 is it thinks that it's a dog. And you can see how as we slide through here, it's very uncertain because it's kind of this mixture between a cat and a dog. And as I go further to the dog face, it starts to predict dog. So it's a model that works really well. And now what we did is we took every single one of these feature maps that you just saw, and we decided to collect certain attributes of every single feature map. So we fed it with 500 cat images and 500 dog images. And for every single image, for every single filter in there, we decided to collect certain attributes, certain features, such as average activation, the entropy within this filter, the variance between pixels, how many pixels were active, Moran's ISO, a lot of spatial features. And then we said if we take an entirely new image, we're able to build a k-nearest neighbor machine learning model and plug it right in and essentially say, well, if we have this filter, for example, any one, and we take all of its spatial features that we had calculated, are we able to kind of predict what classification that image is? Are we able to see something within the filters themselves? And this is the really cool part. I want you to, especially as I go through the morphing, look at the right side, so the final layer where the fine details of the convolution happens, to look how blue means it's more dog, red means it's more cat. So you see a lot of blue currently, and as we go through, it starts to turn more and more red. So cat is a lot of red, while dog is a lot of blue. So that was really, really neat to see that we were able to really see that the network is able to distinguish, especially in the final layer, between cats and dogs. But now the question was, as I go to the last slide here, are we able to optimize a network based off of this visualization, based off this information that we just used? And yes, we can, because the thing is, the gray filters that you're seeing right here, they're completely useless. They have no information whatsoever. And that is one big problem, especially with convolutional neural networks. There's a lot of computation happening. And a lot of this computation is completely useless, as you see, because they're not active. That's just information that gets passed through and doesn't help the network decide whatsoever. So one possible way of trying to get rid of some of these filters, try to prune, as they say, is to look at average activation. So just one of our features that we collected is to look at the average activation of each filter. And the argument was that if a filter is active to a certain degree, more than another filter, then that filter that is not as active is not as useful to the model. But our argument is that that is actually not the case. It is the discriminative factor of every single filter that is important. So for example, if we look at this is filter number 8, so that is that filter right here. That filter has a very strong discriminative factor when it comes to cat and dogs. So the average activation for dogs is entirely different than it is for cats. So even though its activation is not very strong, it is very decisive for the model to see, and you can see for every frame, the dotted line represents the average activation in that image. So as I go through, you see how that line kind of moves further down into the cat region as we look at the cat, and if I go backwards, you see how it pops back up for the dogs. So our argument is that yes, we can indeed optimize a neural network simply by its average activation, but looking at it from a class-based perspective, the discriminative factor is very, very important. So the higher the discriminative factor, the more important that filter is. So in a sense, what we're able to do is we can make machines see cats and dogs even faster. Thank you very much.